out. And uh, so we are recording. We may have a few other people join us later, and if like this one, if people come, we will just admit them, but we'll go ahead and start so that we can make the most of our time. Um, Dehrich, some of us, you may have heard us mention the Zoom chat. Some of us do kind of, the bulk of the action takes place here on Zoom, but
Yeah.
we often have the Zoom chat open. And I don't know if you're accustomed to using the Zoom chat, but if you are, feel free to open it and you'll see people posting comments there as well, especially
Yeah.
Kathy, who can't talk today. um, so we are here today to talk to Dehrich about his fabulous book. Dehrich, we've been away from this book for about a month, I think. So you will help us refresh our memories.
Cool.
Um, and I'm going to start with some easy questions, and then we'll open it up to the group. Dehrich, my first question is, can you please pronounce the title of this book?
Yeah. Yeah. It's Unigkuat is how you say it. Unigkuat.
Unigkuat.
And I don't know if you read the foreword, but if you did, you'd see Alicia Drebeck wrote a little bit about, maybe it was me, I can't remember, but a little bit about the origin of that word and how it actually comes from a verb unisugu, which means to leave something behind. And so it's things that that our ancestors, stories that our ancestors have left behind and passed on through oral history is the origin of that word. And it's used in other parts, or at least similar words with the same origin are used in other parts of Alaska and Yupik and Chupik and I think even Inupiaq, all the way up in very far north Alaska, use a similar word for those kinds of stories.
When did you decide that that would be the title of this book?
Really early on, it was because that is the word that we use like in our language and our culture for that kind of storytelling. We have two different words for story. There's Unigkuat, which are the kinds of stories that are primarily told in that book that are about like how the world works and often have like magical or mystical beings and spirits and all of that creation stories and stuff like that. And then the other kind of story are called Kuliangwat, and those are like historical stories, if that makes sense. So stories that can be tied to a specific like time or person or place or anything like that. And many of those stories, even though like characters have names and stuff, like it's harder to tie it down to a specific time period or place and things like that. So that's basically the separation between those kinds of stories. And so because we have a word for those stories in our language and we didn't have a single place where those stories are all shared, that was why we wanted to use that word for this book.
And well, first of all, tell us about yourself
Okay.
and your work at the Alutiiq Museum, because the book is published, I think, by the
Mhm.
museum. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep, it's a published in-house here. But yeah, my name's Dehrich Chya. My Suchtstun name or Alutiiq name is Izuik, which means seal. I was born in Kodiak, where I live today, but actually grew up kind of in the Anchorage area. We moved around a little bit. So when I was like two, probably, we moved away from Kodiak and moved around on the mainland. Lived in Seward for a little bit when I was real young, and then Anchorage and out in Palmer and um, spent most of my younger years out in Big Lake. And then, then I went to college, did a year at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, before transferring to the University of Hawaii at Hilo, which is where I got my bachelor's degree and loved it there. It was a great time, but yeah, and then right after that, I moved back here to Kodiak. I knew that I wanted to work in my culture doing stuff because growing up my family had a dance group, so I grew up doing Alutiiq dance, and then when I was a teenager I worked at the Alaska Native Heritage Center for a while doing dance and cultural education, and so I knew that I wanted to do something in our culture. And so yeah, I got my bachelor's degree in political science of all things. But moved back to Kodiak after getting that, started working here at the Alutiiq Museum, and also started my master's program. So I have a master's from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in rural development. And I did a project on Kodiak Island place names, Alutiiq place names. But yeah, it was actually not too long after I started working at the museum here that we started developing that book, because I moved back in 2018, and I think that book was published in 2019. So it was about a year or so, less than a year that we started working on the book, and then about a little over a year after I started that we published it and released it. Am I remembering that right, or was it 20? Yeah, no, it must have been 2019 because it was before the pandemic. So a few years ago now that book was released, but yeah. So, but in terms of the other work that I do at the museum, so my title now is Director of Language and Living Culture. So I do a lot of work, as you can imagine, with our language. I learn our language. We meet with elders who still speak the language, try to meet with them at least once weekly, if not more, if we can. And just to learn and document language, but also practice for myself, but also give our elders a chance to use the language too. And then I do, general cultural education stuff, presentations and lectures and tours of the gallery, and go to classrooms and do activities in local classrooms. And then behind the scenes, I do some other like programmatic work, like help out with our social media pages and help write our exhibit text, and then also help with like the payroll and stuff here. So all sorts of stuff. I have a wide variety of work that I do here at the museum, and it's great. No day is ever the same here, which is great. It keeps things from getting boring and stale. So I love the work that I do and feel very fortunate. But yeah.
Can you talk about, yeah, well, I have two questions and maybe they're related. You mentioned that early on you knew that you wanted to do something, that you wanted to work in a way that promoted your culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered, why was that important to you? And I also want to ask, why did you all decide to do the book? Is that the same question, asked different ways?
I think they're related to one another, those questions, but have slightly different answers. I wanted to work in my culture, and because it was always a big part of my life, like growing up, like I said, my family had a dance group, and so we would dance, do performances at like the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and we traveled to other places a few times, like to Seattle, and I think the farthest we went was to North Carolina to do dance at a big cultural festival that they had there. And so yeah, dance was always a big part of my life, and then when I worked at the Heritage Center as a dancer, I got some exposure to other Alaska Native cultures and culture, dancing and cultural traditions from other parts of Alaska. And I got to teach people about my culture and about all these other cultures. But it was very an influential part of my life when I was a teenager to be able to do that work, to be able to talk about my people and educate people about that. And so it was something that I also got pretty good at over the few summers that I worked at the Heritage Center, and that, well, and then also I traveled to a culture camp here on Kodiak called Dig Afognak, which is run by one of the tribes here, the native village of Afognak. And I was out there to teach dance. And at this camp, there was, it was the first year that they were really like making a huge active effort in incorporating language into the program of the camp. So they had a lot of elders and speakers out there, and then also some learners, second language learners of our language. And it was the first time that I'd ever heard our language being spoken like conversationally, because I'd heard a handful of words from like my grandma. And then, of course, when we dance, we sing in our language. But it didn't really occur to me when I was, 10 that we're singing in a different language that I could like learn. So going to this camp when I was, 15 and hearing our language being spoken conversationally like that really inspired me to want to learn our language myself. And so that started my language learning journey. And the Alutiiq Museum has always had played a heavy part of Alutiiq language revitalization on Kodiak. And so when I was wrapping up college, I had had a pretty base level knowledge of our language, but it was something that I knew I wanted to explore more. And so I knew, I had reached out to the museum as I was wrapping up my bachelor's degree to see if there was any openings or anything like that. And it just happened to work out that there was an internship that was available, and I applied for that and got it, and then transferred from being an intern into a full-time staff member, and now I'm on the management team. So just worked my way up over the years. Yeah.
I love that story. I work at a college, and I love that you reached out to the museum and said, "Hey, are there opportunities?" And look how it turned out for you. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, it really is.
What about the book? How did the idea for the book come about?
Yeah. So like I said, it was pretty early, like pretty soon after I started here that we started to work on the book. I believe we started so I okay, so I started at the museum in June of 2018 as an intern. And then by February the following year in 2019 is when we started to get stuff together. Now, a lot of my time as an intern, because I was also working on my master's degree at the same time, and so there was a little bit of time as an intern that I was able to work on my master's degree, which was researching place names. Well, as I was researching place names, I was also like fascinated by researching all this other like cultural stuff. And one of those things that came up with stories. And the museum had wanted to do a story book for a while now, because we even still we have like lists of project ideas that we'd like to do, and then we finally had funding that worked out like from a couple of different places that we could use to pull together and create this book. And so I had gotten some skills and doing research on like finding where stuff was. And so Amy Steffian, who just recently retired from the museum here, wanted me to help out on this book. And so I started, yeah, finding different stories in different places with her, of course. And together we found all of the Alutiiq stories that we could from all these different places, and then had to reach out to all of these because, of course, we don't own the rights to all of these stories. They're all published in different places, but we had to go and get permission from everybody. And of course, everybody was happy to let us include those stories in the book. But yeah, I mean, it was 6 years ago, so I'm trying to remember if there's any like specific spark that led to the development of the book. But I think it was just one of those projects that the museum had wanted to do, and I was interested in like going out and finding where some of these stories were, and then we had the funding too that worked out, so that there were I think two or three different pots of money that helped put this together. So one of them, the Kodiak Island Borough School District, had a grant from the Department of Education that they contracted us to help on. And so we used some funding from that to create this book that we were going to share with the school district in all of the classrooms. And then we had another grant, the Munachtit project, which was through the Alaska State Council on the Arts. That grant is ending this year, but it's a partnership of a bunch of different organizations, including the museum and the school district, but also the Arts Council and Kodiak College and stuff. And so we all work together to incorporate art into schools. And so that's one of the reasons why we're able to incorporate so much, art and illustration into it as well, is because we had this art integration grant. And yeah, so all of that helped us make it happen. So.
Well, we loved this book. We loved the stories. We loved the art. We loved the way that we maybe tried to learn words while we were reading.
Yeah.
It's very different from most of the books that we've read, and we feel like it's a real treasure and a real treat to have read it, and a special treat to talk to you.
Oh.
I see that people are starting to raise their hands. Excellent. So let's open it up to the group. Narit, you're first, and then Marcia.
Yeah. Um, Nice to meet you in person. I enjoyed, flipping through the book and read this story, and it was very different, obviously, for me to read something like this, but I loved it. So thank you for, bringing this to life. Um, I read in the book, I think it was at the beginning, that about the importance of storytelling for the indigenous culture. And not just storytelling, the retelling is so important because if I understood it right, each person who retells it actually puts into the story something from their own. Um, and it was told even in a different manner or different way depending on who was the audience listening to the stories, and could learn so much about the values and the history and so on, and the connection to the culture. And there was a point where it was said there that most likely the Western society, people will have a problem to actually understand um, what it is that there are situations or values that cannot be explained uh, to the Western world in a way that they would understand because they are blocked, like towards certain cultures, certain ideas, and so on. And just to, for example, to show you an example, the story about the Northern Lights. When I read it, I remember bringing it up even when we were discussing the book. I couldn't understand why something so beautiful as the Northern Light will cause death, will cause punishment because people were dancing. So I was looking for what is behind it. And actually, one of our, unfortunately, Holly, I don't think she's here today, but she helped me kind of to understand that. But my question after all of this speech, I'm sorry, my question to you would be one is who is the audience actually that this book was written to? Is it to the whole world, uh, wanting to expose the culture and so on? Is it to your own people? Is it to the indigenous people that they should be familiar with the stories, but then they will read it? They're not going to be listening to it. Will it have the same effect? And the other question was, uh, my brain, I forget, but I had I had another question. But maybe you can at least tell us a little bit about the audience. Who was it written to, and what is the purpose? Will it be successful? I mean, we read it, and there you go. A group of quite, I don't know, nice number of people who never read this before were exposed to it. And not only that, we will talk to our friends and families and so on, and it is better known. But I don't know that we understand it properly and correctly.
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's a great question, and I think that speaks to the work that we do at the museum more broadly, where we do kind of have like almost like a multifaceted like layers of who our audience is, because we serve a lot of different people, and we have to think about that when we're doing anything, including just like our exhibits here, like in our space, where we have to think about, like, we want to educate our own people, because there are a lot of people who are Alutiiq who come into the museum will know a lot of stuff, but then there's also stuff that they may not know, or stories that just haven't really been told in our history and stuff a lot. And so we think about that. And so at the first level, our primary audience for everything we do, including this book, is our own people, because something like storytelling is a tradition that was taken from us for a long time. And today there aren't a lot of people who remember hearing stories like this. Our elders grew up like hearing these kinds of stories, but they all say like, I wasn't really paying attention then. I don't really remember them all that well. Like people told them, but so there aren't a lot of people who still tell stories in this way. And so we're trying to share these stories so that our own people can learn them and then create storytellers from it. But we also have a larger audience too. So at the second level, our audience is the general public. We want people to learn about our people and about our culture and about our traditions, because that benefits everybody. If people are more aware about our people, then they'll be more understanding about how our cultures are maybe different in some ways, but also see some of the similarities. And that helps just build bridges across communities. And so in terms of writing this book, we try to appeal to both of those audiences in different ways, I think. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And Nurit, if you think of the second part of your question, we'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Marsha, Lori, Naomi, and then Elizabeth.
Thank you for joining us. I enjoyed the book. I, in fact, shared it with several friends. I gave them copies. My brother-in-law grew up next to and was sort of mentored and adopted by indigenous clan in the Midwest United States, and grew up practicing their culture and practices. So really related to reading the book. And your description of your life, I just find fascinating. The immersion in the culture of the dance, which I consider a type of communication, and going to that camp and seeing the language as communication and working with that language is just fascinating to me and exciting. I can't imagine. I just think what you're doing is amazing. My question is the book, I won't try to use the words so I don't disrespect them, but that there were the two types of stories, the one type that is included in this book, and then the type that is more directly related to specific people and history and stuff. The book, the legends that you included in this book, are they everything you could find, or what choices did you make in terms of editing that these were the important ones that your culture should remember and learn, and that the world should learn?
Yeah. For the most part, this was all of the stories that we could find that were
great
of this kind. There was one story that we left out because we didn't know how to tell it in a way that would come across the way that it's supposed to. And this was a story about the sun and the moon, and it's kind of a dark story. And so I want to prepare you all for that, because I want to tell a brief summary of it so that y'all can hear it. But it does deal with sexual assault and incest. And the reason we left it out is because we didn't want it to sound like that is glorified in our culture in any way. And in fact, it's in our culture, the story it tells it as a taboo. as why you shouldn't do those things. But the story of the creation of the sun and the moon is that there was this family who lived in a village, and the men and the women, were sleeping separately, and there's this daughter who is sexually assaulted repeatedly night after night, and so she gets the idea that one time she's going to fight back, and then she'll know who it is. And so she does. She takes a knife and she cuts the person who's assaulting her, and she finds out that it was her brother. And so in shame, they both start to run away. She runs away from the village and he chases after her. And they just run away from the village, and they're still running, and they become the sun and the moon. And so that story, like I said, it is real dark, and we didn't want something that dark in this book. But yeah, that's the only story that we left out of it. So everything else, yeah, all the other stories, even though there are some that have dark parts in it, like I'm thinking of the girl who went in search of her lover, and there's that piece of art where there's like the heads on the pikes and stuff like that. So there are some dark themes that we left in the book, but that one was just we felt it was a little too much, and we didn't know how we could edit it to keep the essence of the story while making it clear that it wasn't something we were trying to glorify.
Thank you. That makes the book all more special for me, that it's so comprehensive, a compilation of stories to have and be able to read. I hope your life continues to be so exciting.
Thank you. And I do think that there are probably still some stories out there that we didn't catch, or that we didn't find or didn't include that we would. And so hopefully someday we'll have a second edition that'll have more. So
Wonderful. I'll buy that one. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Marcia. Lori, then Naomi, then Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks for joining us, Dehrich. I really enjoyed the book. What struck me about a lot of the stories was how similar they are to the stories of other groups of Native Americans from different parts of North America. And it makes me think that these people took these stories with them as they spread out across North America, and whether they settled in the plains or in the southern U.S. or the eastern, they kept these stories, the core part of the story. Little things may have changed, but the core part of these stories were the same. And so it made me wonder how far back these stories go in history. And has anyone done a comparison of these stories with stories from Native peoples in, say, Asia, and to see the comparisons? I just wonder just how far back they go.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know of any specific studies that were done. There was a lady, I actually don't know what, it was in the early to mid 1900s. I don't know exactly when, but Margaret Lantis is her name, and I'm gonna write that in the chat in case anybody wants to search it up. But she wrote an article on some of these stories. She analyzed some of the stories and compared them to, I think, just maybe some other Alaska Native stories, but it wasn't all of them. It was just like a handful of some of them, and that's the only study that I know of that kind of compares them, like in an anthropological way. But like in our oral history, like I think that we all know that people did share these stories, and I think the clearest example in this book is the raven who stole the moon, or in this, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Raven who stole the light is told all over Alaska and beyond. And this is a story that has very clearly been shared and is edited in different cultures to fit their environment and the stuff around them so that it's familiar. But the version that we have there are two different accounts of this story that I know of, again, historically. One of them was the version that we adapted and put into the book was told by Fedosia Laktonen, who was from Karluk in the 1960s. But there was an earlier version from Kodiak that was documented in like 1899 or around sometime around then, by a guy named Frank Golder. So if you read some of the citations at the end of the stories, Frank Golder comes up a few times. And he had documented a version of that same story from Kodiak as well. And so that's cool to see when we have a storyteller from, there's audio of her telling this story in Alutiiq to a linguist, Irene Reed. And then, 70 years before that, a written version that was documented by another guy. So you can see that this story has been kept alive, and you can compare those even just from same versions of the story from Kodiak. There's another story, the Girl Who Married the Moon is another example where we have multiple versions of that story. Golder wrote a version down from, again, the 1890s or early 1900s. And then as recently as the 2000s, there was a storyteller from Karluk who told that same story. And so, yeah, again, just it's cool to be able to see that. But in terms of how far these stories go back, we don't know for sure, but there are certain things that jump out as like, could that be just an example of oral history, like sharing about the world over these many, many generations? Because the story, one of my favorite stories from the book is the boy who became a mink. And that one starts off by saying, this story takes place so long ago that there weren't any winds, and so they could travel much farther without having to worry about the weather than we do today. And we know from a scientific standpoint and geologic standpoint that when people first arrived in Kodiak at the end of the last Pleistocene, there were less winds, like the weather wasn't as severe as it is today when people were first getting here. And so it's possible that it's just a storytelling trope. And so it just explains like why he's able to go so far away from his home. But it's also possible that that's something that survived, that people remembered this time, or at least in stories, they talk about this time where, it was very calm all the time, and now it's not. And so, obviously, again, we don't know for sure, but there are things like that jump out as like, could that be an example of how oral history can hold on to stuff that the written record just can't. Yeah.
Yeah, in some of the stories they talk about their stone knife or their stone tools. So this is before the colonization, and they've got, metal knives and axes and so forth. They're still using the stone tools. And it was amazing to me how far back some of these stories were captured by researchers, the 1870s on some of them. So that was pretty neat to see that. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Naomi, you're up next.
Yeah, I actually heard the story about the sun and the moon getting into the sky from my Yupik intern at Katmai. And knowing him leads me into my basic question to you. The oral histories were really important to him. That year I did an evening program to help people bring their Katmai story home. Because I know that in our, modern American culture, we don't have a great, rich oral tradition. And I know that it's very valuable. So my Yupik intern, Sam, made sure he came to every one of my evening programs because this was really important to him. And he told stories like you have in this book at every session. And I showed a video of him doing that to this group when we went over your book. So because I regret in our own culture the dearth of, or maybe the death of, oral history, I wonder what the current interest among Alutiiq youth is in the oral histories and the stories from their elders, because it's so valuable in so many ways. I mean, I don't want to list them because you know them, but but I wonder how important are these stories to them, and are there any outreach programs to youth with these stories?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And one thing that we've done is we've tried to adapt these stories and storytelling into newer ways. I'm going to share a link in the chat. Maybe you found this as you were talking about the book, but the museum before I was here actually created a little cartoon about one of these stories with the help of a local artist for the girl who married the moon. And so that's one way that the museum has tried to adapt it into, still share the story with people, but in a different medium. But we've also, so at the museum, we have these education boxes that we loan out to different classrooms or events and camps and stuff like that. And one of the boxes that we have centers around storytelling. And so we have a number of different activities for storytelling to do with kids. And so we can do just like a no visual aid, like somebody tell a story, and we've done that. And then afterward we do an activity like I did that with the Raven Who Stole the Light. Like I went to a classroom and I just told the story. It was with an older group, high school kids. Told the story to them and told them to pay attention to themes that they liked about the story that jumped out at them and things like that. And then they did an activity after. But we also do, especially with younger kids up into like middle school, shadow puppets. Those are really popular with the kids, where we have actually all of the schools have a little shadow puppet stage. So it's basically just a big piece of cardboard with a sheet of tissue paper covering a hole. So then you shine a light, and we have little characters that go with some of the stories. And so we'll do that, and we'll tell a story, and then we'll encourage them to either write their own story and make their own shadow puppets, or make shadow puppets for either the same story they heard or another story from the book that they like. And so we're that's one way that we're trying to sort of keep these stories alive and a more familiar style is with we have this one animated version, and then we have the shadow puppets, and then we also have done like comic strips with them. So we'll tell them, because comic strips are kind of interesting because there's only like 3 to 5 boxes, and these stories, some of them are kind of long, and so they have to think about which scenes that they want to include that helps them still tell the full story with just consolidated into those 4 or 5 boxes for the comic.
Yeah, I mean, do you know how much this, like Gen Z and younger actually hear these stories from grandparents or elders?
Not a lot, because storytelling really wasn't done like it's something that kind of has went away within the last like 100 years or so, because most of our elders today, like I've asked the ones that we meet with regularly, like oh, have you heard this story, or do you know anything about this story? And they'll be like, people told stories like that, but I didn't pay attention when I was younger. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, why storytelling has kind of disappeared, but it has been, there just aren't a lot of people who still tell these stories now. And so it's one of the reasons we wanted to make this book and incorporate it into the classroom activities and stuff that we do, is so that we can keep them alive. And I think there's probably more interest in storytelling now than there was, from people 50 years ago, 20 to 50 years ago, so.
I mean, I think that, as cultures get robbed of their cultures by others. Those kinds of things go away. I mean, my own example was, my ancestors came from Russia, and they fled from the pogroms where they were killing all the Jews. And I didn't know until my grandfather's funeral that he was a published Yiddish poet.
Wow.
And I was so angry at my family for not telling me that. I mean, I didn't know Yiddish. I mean, I was completely acculturated, right? I mean, robbed and separated from that culture. But I was just like, why didn't I know that? And it was a sense of, from my Yupik intern that, Sam, that he had wanted that connection too, just as I had. So it was, it felt like a commonality. And two minor things, which was one, this is backpack. And the other one was that I loved, and I don't know who sent me the book from the museum, but they included these recipe cards with the book, and I was so thrilled to get them. But I'm gonna have to go back to Alaska because the one that I really want to do requires 2 pounds of salmon berries. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Naomi. Elizabeth, you're next.
Thank you, Dehrich. I really love the book for multiple reasons. I found the stories fascinating, but also so hard to understand by the Western mind. And one of the things, so I actually tried to study the language to figure out parts of speech and all of that. And one of the things that really struck me in some of the titles and in the glossary in the back is that it seems like that for nouns, they're really the gerund form of the verb, the ing form of the verb. It's like a doing of some sort that makes the noun. So I was thinking, no wonder Westerners can't understand this, because we separate the noun and the verb. And so it gives you a construct that's 100% different, because you're thinking in terms of not separating an object and subject, but encompassing it. So I'd love for you to comment on that. And then there were probably the story that hit me the hardest was, and I don't know the name of it. I've been trying to flip through the book to find. I've read the whole book, by the way, and underlined it and made notes, but I can't keep it all in my head. But it was about the woman who, I think she refused to get married. She sat in the sod house, and there was a man who came to her, and then he would cut and bloodlet, and that's how she would have children. And she had, I think, 4 or 5 sons and 1 daughter. And then, and the youngest was the leader of all of them for some reason. I can't remember why. I'm not sure if he ever laid with her. I think he did one time, but I'm not 100% sure. And then the whole rest of the story spins out the relationships between those 4 brothers and the daughter and the man and the wife. But I can't remember how it ends or why it ends. But I thought, why? And he would not let her look at him. I don't know whether he was the moon or what. I don't know if that's the same story. But I was fascinated by that. So that was one. Another one, I'll just tell you ones I loved. I loved the one about the white-faced bear. Yeah. And I couldn't believe the hunter would try to kill an animal who'd helped him. And the same thing about the next story, which was also about the hunter who was a mean guy who wanted to kill a nice bear. Anyway, and I couldn't believe the bear was so forgiving of the man, even though he tried to kill her. When she said, if you see a bear with a cub, don't kill that one. And he still tried to do it, and he couldn't do it. His arrows broke or something. And then she turned her back, and he borrowed some, and he was going to do the same thing. And so that's when she came and decided to kill him. You've had your chances. I've given you a reprieve. I've forgiven you. And she was in love with him. That was the other thing. And then the other one, which I didn't understand the humor in it, was the stickleback. The one about the fish with the thorns on its back, I had to look that up to figure out what that is. And I didn't understand why the young boy minded that the fish was singing his name. Why he got so mad at the fish that he smushed it. He just stopped it. And I don't think he killed it, but I thought, what's this about? I couldn't understand that. And then one other one was all the cannibalism I saw in there. And I wondered, is that part of the ancient culture that maybe when they first came, they had to kill people in order to get enough food? And then the other one about the whaler who killed people so he could get the human oil. I didn't even know humans had oil. And he put that around the whale because the whale knew not to get close to humans. So anyway, if you can make something out of that mess I just gave you, good luck.
Yeah. So starting off with that first story about the girl who gave birth by bloodletting, I think that one was one of in the early part of the book about the sun and the moon. It is another sun and moon story, and that's one of the longer ones, and also one of the ones that was like really, it took a lot to edit to make it a little bit comprehensible, because even still it's like there's a lot going on in that story and it's hard to make sense of it all. But that one was documented in the 1870s by Alphonse Pinart, who was from France, and he went around Kodiak and documented stories and dances and language stuff, and so there's a lot of really great information that he documented while he was here. And there are some themes in that story, especially early on, that are really similar to the girl who married a star. Like about a girl who doesn't want to get married. She doesn't understand why she has to get married, and so she refuses. But then she's either ridiculed or like kidnapped by a pretty boy to he forces her to become her wife, and she eventually gets help. And the girl who married the star, she gets help to escape, and ends up marrying the Starman. But in the Sun and the Moon one, I'm trying to remember, because it's similar, where she doesn't want to get married, but she does for some reason. I don't remember the specifics of the story, but yeah. So there are some stories that have real similar themes, even though they're not exactly the same story. And that's one example. The woman who becomes a bear. That story too there's another story that has some similar themes in it. Trying to remember the name of it, but it's another. So the girl who became a bear, in Ukchinguk, was told by Fedoja Lactonin of Karluk again. But then Pinart also wrote a story, or documented a story from Kodiak that was similar, where a man abandons his wife on a rock, but she gets help to go find him again, and she becomes a bear and kills him. So yeah, lots of stories that have very similar themes like that. The ones where, because there are also a couple that talk about a hunter who, and who like gets help from a bear, or the bear falls in love with the hunter, but he still tries to kill them anyway. But is never successful in doing that. And I think that's the takeaway, the lesson of those stories, is that you shouldn't be like, one of the big things in our culture, and other Alaskan Native cultures, is that as a hunter, you're not supposed to be boastful, you're not supposed to brag, you're not supposed to be cocky about your abilities and stuff. So I think those stories touch on that hot-headedness, where you have a real good hunter who tries to outsmart a bear. And actually, even the story about Ukchinguk and the woman who becomes a bear, at the end, the storyteller says, and that's why you should never hunt a bear with a cub. Yeah. So that's a repeated theme as well. And I'm not sure why, but I just find that interesting that comes up in multiple different stories from across different time periods, But anyway, it touches on that, like, don't lie, especially to a bear, because they'll get you. But then, but yeah, and then also be respectful, like as a hunter, like and as a person, like if somebody extends kindness to you, don't use that against them, you know.
And what was the humor of the stickleback?
Oh yeah, the stickleback. I just think that's an example of humor that doesn't translate well.
No.
And that storyteller, so that one is also Fedoja Lactonen. There is a lot of humor centered around death in a real lighthearted way. So I think that the boy does end up killing the stickleback, and I don't know why he gets so upset about his name being called either. I think it's mostly just that like he was annoyed, like he couldn't find out who was singing to him, but then like he just kept hearing his name, and so he's just like, what is going on, like who's doing that, like that's enough, I've stop that. And then he finds out it was a fish, and he is just annoyed by it. I'm not exactly sure why, but the other stories that she tells, so there's the magpie one where at the end the magpie, I can't remember if the magpie dies, but it's just like the humor of the story is that this little magpie like eats a whole seal on a whole sea lion and then drinks an entire lake all by itself. And that's just a funny little cute story, but like there's not really a lesson in that story. Maybe don't be gluttonous, I guess. But then she tells a version of the raven who stole the light. And at the end of the story, the raven puts the sun up and puts the moon up and puts the stars up. And people hadn't seen light in so long that it makes them all sneezy. And so they all start sneezing, and they sneeze so much that they die. And that's how that story ends. And it's just like there's recordings of her telling those stories in Alutiiq, and she is just cracking up, like telling these stories. And so I think it's just like humor for the sake of humor almost in some of the cases. Like it's just so outlandish that you would sneeze so much that you die because the sun was out, So
it seems like some of the stories, and that's how I tell it. It's like,
yep.
Yeah, that's just how it is. It's like a cutoff. And as you were talking about the stickleback, I was wondering if it's like a little boy, egging on another little boy saying, nah, 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 like the stickleback was kind of doing that.
Yeah, it very well could be. And I think it must be because the stickleback, the words of the song is like he says his name, and then the only other word is like Anseang means I went out. So it's almost like it's talking about coming out of the water, like I coming out of the water. Probably is like coming up on one side and then swimming and coming up on the other side and just antagonizing the boy, I would assume.
Yeah, I wondered what that meant. And can you
Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to the other hands that are raised, and if we have time at the end, we'll come back to you, if that's okay. We've got lots of hands up right now.
Okay.
And Judy, we haven't heard from you yet, so you're next.
I just have a question that's more in general to why stories were not remembered and passed on early on in the culture. And is it possible that just using the word story was sort of a word that didn't encourage people to remember their culture and stories as though they were sort of becoming more modern, and remembering stories just was kind of too disinteresting, I guess. I'm just kind of thinking it through as you mentioned that, and wondering if maybe the word story was just kind of too just not the right word to get people to stay more interested in remembering the stories of their culture. They were too busy getting modern and not wanting to think about the past.
Yeah, it's possible. I've thought about this as to like why storytelling might be like dwindling or has dwindled here in Kodiak, and honestly, I think one of the things is kind of related to modernization, but also Christianity on Kodiak had a huge effect on our culture in general. And I don't mean to say it in a negative way, because there are a lot of people here who are still very devout Orthodox people. But it did change our culture here on Kodiak in a number of ways. And I think storytelling is one of those ways that it, like I think many stories were altered, not necessarily like consciously or anything, but just the way that people told stories was changed by the introduction of things like Christianity and Orthodoxy here. And one example I can think of is there's the story about the sage and the shaman. And that is another one that we edited slightly. We had a lot of conversations internally and with other culture bearers here about changing it, because that story says that the Gusuk, or the original version that was documented, says the Gusuk was higher than the Gasalik. And the Gusuk is a spiritual leader, Gasalik was the shaman. And to me, that didn't make any sense, because the shaman was always talked about, Gasalik was always talked about as like being having the most spiritual power, and a Gusuk had a lot of power in the community, but was like an in between shamans who had connections with the spirit world directly and the people. And so the word Gusuk was eventually applied not to spiritual leaders, but to priests, specifically like Orthodox priests. And so we thought that it was a matter of like the attitudes changing, and people putting a priest above a shaman. And so we flopped it, like flip-flopped it in the version that we told, because it made more cultural sense in the spirit of that specific story about how shamans were helping create different aspects of the world with the help of the spiritual leader. I can't remember where I started talking about this, but or if that answers your question. But certainly there are different reasons why storytelling is kind of dwindling, but also has changed over time.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thanks, Judy, for that question. Marley, you're next.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to say where you live and grew up and where you decided to go to college, two of the most beautiful places on the planet. So that's good choices. So I have two questions. One is, there is a theme that runs through a bunch of the stories about basically people not doing what they're told and the consequences of not doing what they're told. And I'm, sort of almost a little bit morality, and, as way to teach, lessons of, good and bad, and what, you should do and shouldn't do. And I'm just curious if when you, meet with especially students and go over these stories, if they see that common theme running through a lot of them. And my second question is about, in several stories, people put on either a part of the bear or a part of the bird or a part of the animal as a way to turn into that animal to accomplish what it is they're trying to accomplish. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about how that sort of fits the relationship between the people and the animals.
Yeah, thank you for that. On the morality of stories, that is something that when we tell stories in classrooms or at camps or whatever, we do talk about that, how a lot of the times, not every time, because there are some stories that are just for fun, like the Stickleback one, I think is a great example of that. But there are also a lot of stories that have a lesson of some kind in them, and sometimes they have more than one lesson. And so we do have that discussion and have kids think about that, or tell them the lesson if they can't think of it themselves, and all of that. But with the putting on parts of an animal, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a really important theme about storytelling on Kodiak and Yupik culture as well. And it's actually a direct reason why, like if you've ever seen Kodiak dance or seen Kodiak Alutiiq masks, we use masks in our dance because of that belief that putting on that part of an animal or what have you can transform you into the animal. Masks represented that transformation in our dance. And so we'll have masks that represent, a puffin or a seal or something. And when you put on that mask, you embody that animal and that spirit. and it's represents that physical transformation in our dance. And so they were really important tools for ceremonies and for shamans as well, who use them in their rituals and stuff like that. So, but yeah, there are a lot of stories, and also of the reverse happening too, where like there's the fox girl who she takes off her fox skin and becomes a human, although a human that still has aspects of an animal, like sharp teeth, that the magpie sister realizes and calls her out on, right? But yeah, so you have that, the reverse happening too, where animals can take off their skin or their beak and become a human form of that animal, and that happens for a number of reasons, but a lot of the time is to introduce like a love interest, or to teach lessons about you know how to treat those different beings and things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna call attention to the time. It is 5:01. I promised Dehrich that we'd be done by 5, and so now I'm a liar. But we do need to start wrapping up. I think Narit had her hand raised and then down. Naomi has her hand raised. I'm hoping after Naomi that Leanne or someone might ask a question about art, and then we will wrap this up. I don't think we're going to be able to get to you, Elizabeth. We're already over time. I'm sorry. So Narit, and then Naomi, and then hopefully somebody about art, and then we will let Dehrich go not long after I promised him that he would be able to go.
I put my hand down because actually Marley took my question about the how do you use the education programs, with the children? Do you talk about the morals? Do you discuss it? Or so you've answered that, and I think you're doing a great, great, great. I don't know how to call it, like something amazing, very, very important for everybody, not just the indigenous people, but for everybody. It's fantastic to be exposed to this. So I'm going to take this chance to thank you again for doing it. Maybe I'll ask if you see actually a trend of for change, that stories are read now to these young people, students and so on. Do you, I don't know, maybe it's too early, but do you hope or see through them there will be a change, and they will go back and tell their kids and so on stories? Or, and with Judy talking about the word story, my question also is, in English we have story, we have a tale, we have legend. Do you have in your language also so many words for telling something? Or is it just one word, and I don't know, what would you translate it to? Is it story or maybe something else?
Yeah. So we have the two words. Unigkuat is this that we use legend in English to relate that. Some people translate Unigkuat, like elders will say fairy tale, but other people say, myth, or I guess just those ones. But we went with legend because fairy tale and myth kind of have a connotation that they're like not true in English, and so we didn't want to have that connotation in our thing. So that's why we went with legend. And then Kuliyangwak is like the history stories, the ones that, like if an elder tells about a hunting trip they went on, that's a Kuliyangwak, rather than Unigkuat. But those are just the two words that we have for different stories.
Thank you, Narit. Naomi, go ahead.
Just a quick comment that so my background, I studied anthropology and specialized in myth and symbolism. So, and what stands out to me is how common these themes are all over the world in so many cultures. And I just said it's And so I think that just says something about being human and being part of a culture. My only comment, and other than thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dehrich, Leanne has asked me to ask you about the art. So I will ask you about the art because the art is such an important part of this book. One thing I wondered just listening to you today, whether the process of collecting the art and sharing the art, is that a way to involve young people in to involve them in the storytelling? Do you know what I mean? To make those stories alive for them?
Yeah, that was something that we really wanted to do for young people, but also for everybody, because I really think art can help anything come to life. And the important thing about art is that, our people have been artists for thousands and thousands of years, and our people are still artists, and make traditional art like earrings, jewelry, carvings, and headdresses, and all of that stuff, but also make art in new ways too, and including, digital art and painting and all of that. And so we wanted to bring that to life too in the story. And I think that the art in the book just does a really great job of helping people be immersed in what's happening on the pages. And there's something to be said about entirely being able to use your imagination to put yourself into those places. But I think especially for something, because like so many of you have said, that it's so different, it's almost hard to imagine some of that stuff. And so I think having the art there really helps kind of ground people and puts you in those settings in a really awesome way. And so I'm really glad that we were able to work with artists, and we're just also so appreciative of all of the artists, because we of course we paid all of the artists that wrote or created art for the book, but we didn't pay them near what what artists are worth, as a nonprofit. We didn't. And so we're really grateful that in lieu of that, everybody was more than happy to include pieces. And we also only said that we're going to pay for one illustration, but so many people provided more than one for their story. And so we're just as a testament that people were also excited about this book, and getting it out there and being able to provide art for that, and everything. I just want to let people know I put my email in the chat. If anybody has follow-up questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer additional questions and things.
Thank you for doing that. I was going to ask you to do that. One final question, and I apologize for not giving you a heads up. We are the Fat Bear Book Club. We love to read books, especially books about bears, but not only books about bears. Do you have any recommendations of books that we should read?
There was actually just within the last year a book published about bears on Kodiak, and we met with the guy. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I will email you the title of the book, and get that to you, because that would be great, I think. So I'll get that to you.
We love that. We've read about, 12 or 15 books, and our list of books to read is about 50 or 60, but we love getting new recommendations.
Great.
Dehrich, this was a treat. It was a treat to read this, and such a treat, such a privilege to talk to you. We always learn so much from talking to our authors, and I think that's been especially true today. So thank you for going over. Thank you for being so generous with your time, and thank you for this book.
Thank you all. It was so great to connect with you all. I'm so glad that you all enjoyed the book, and I'm glad that I was able to be here.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.